I'm Secretary Deb Holland, and I'm honored to join you from the ancestral homelands of the Anacostan and Piscataway people on what President Biden has proclaimed as National Missing or Murdered Indigenous Persons Awareness Day. I wish we didn't need to be here. I wish that this day was obsolete and that we didn't have to keep fighting year after year for our people to be honored and respected. But we are here. And I want to use today to shine a light on the national crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous peoples and give space to others to share the work they are doing on this issue. Everyone deserves to feel safe in their communities, but the MMIP crisis is one that Native communities have faced since the dawn of colonization. For too long, this issue has been swept under the rug by our government with a lack of urgency, attention, or funding. The rates of missing persons cases and violence against American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian communities are disproportionate, alarming, and unacceptable. It's heartbreaking to know that our loved ones are at an increased risk of disappearing without warning, leaving families and communities devastated. I want to extend my gratitude to the organizers, advocates, and Native women who have been shedding light on the MMIP crisis for decades. People who have had an empty chair at their kitchen tables, loved ones who tirelessly search for their relatives, service providers who hear the heartbreaking stories from family members of the missing. I want you to know that I see you and I stand with you. In our first year, there is much that the Biden-Harris administration has done to take this issue seriously. As many of you know, last year I announced the formation of a new missing and murdered unit within the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Office of Justice Services, to provide leadership and direction for cross-departmental and interagency work involving missing and murdered American Indians and Alaska Natives. The MMU is marshaling law enforcement resources across federal agencies and throughout Indian country to focus on this crisis. Since the launch of the MMU, the department has built out personnel and increased infrastructure capacity by launching new offices. Today, 17 BIA offices located throughout the nation have at least one agent dedicated to solving missing and murdered cases for American Indians and Alaska Natives. In December, the BIA announced the launch of its new website dedicated to solving missing and murdered cases in Indian country. The website is bia.gov/MMU. That's bia.gov/MMU. The site is an important tool to help law enforcement families and communities to share critical information about missing and murdered individuals that can help the MMU solve cases and give closure to families. The website showcases individual missing and murdered case profiles that can be quickly shared via social media and other digital media to raise the visibility of victims. It also provides multiple pathways to submit important tips and other case information that may help investigators with the detection or investigation of an offense committed in Indian country. The MMU has enabled the department to expand its collaborative efforts with other agencies, such as working to enhance the DOJ's National Missing and Unidentified Persons System. Staff are also developing strategic partnerships with additional stakeholders, such as the FBI's behavioral analysis units, the FBI Forensic Laboratory, the U.S. Marshals Missing Child Unit, and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. This unit and Interior will continue to engage in collaborative efforts with tribal, federal, and state stakeholders to ensure accurate data and enhance community outreach. The MMU is a critical tool in our work to address this crisis, and today we announce steps for another. In Congress, I led the Not Invisible Act. Now, in partnership with the Justice Department and with extensive engagement with tribes and other stakeholders, we're putting that law into action. Today, our agencies announced the membership of the new Not Invisible Act Commission, which we formed last year. For the first time, the Interior and Justice Department will be guided by an advisory committee composed of law enforcement, tribal leaders, federal partners, service providers, family members of missing and murdered individuals, and most importantly, survivors. This commission will ensure that we hear the voices of those who are most impacted by this issue. It includes diverse experiences, backgrounds, and geography to provide balanced points of view. The commission will hold hearings, take testimony, and receive evidence to develop recommendations for the federal government to combat violent crimes against Indigenous people. The missing and murdered Indigenous peoples crisis is centuries in the making, and it will take a focused effort and time to unravel the many threads that contribute to the alarming rates of these cases. I'm grateful to those of you who rang the alarm and gave a voice to the missing. My heart goes out to the families of loved ones who were impacted by violence. We'll keep working to address this issue, and together, I believe we will provide justice for survivors and families. And now I'll turn the floor over to Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco, who will share recorded remarks for today's event.
I'm pleased to join you for this important event on a day the President has dedicated to highlighting the crisis of missing or murdered Indigenous persons. This is an opportunity to reflect on the violence endured by far too many Native persons for far too long. It's also a chance to reaffirm our commitment to bringing justice and answers to grieving communities. Today marks a major milestone in those efforts as we take the next step in launching our joint commission under the Not Invisible Act. The mission is an essential one to reduce violence against American Indians and Alaska Natives. Today, you'll hear from several tribal leaders about how important the commission is to that work. And I'd like to extend a special thanks to Secretary Holland for her leadership here, both during her time in Congress and through the Department of the Interior's efforts to establish this commission. Today's announcement is a testament to her dedicated work and to the many people across Native communities who fought to make their voices heard. The Department of Justice is committed to supporting the work of the Commission. We're pleased that the Director of our Office of Tribal Justice, Tracy Toulouse, will serve as a co-chair of the Commission, and that he'll be joined by representatives from across the department, including from both our law enforcement and grant-making components. No one agency can solve this problem alone, and we're also grateful that the Commission will include representatives from our partners at the Departments of the Interior and Health and Human Services. But it is the appointees just announced by Secretary Holland who come from outside the federal government who will form the backbone of the commission. These commissioners represent a diverse range of experiences, expertise, and perspectives, and critically, they include survivors who can speak firsthand to the urgency of the commission's work. They also include tribal leaders and members who know best what their communities need when it comes to making them safer. The Commission will issue recommendations to both the Department of Justice and the Department of the Interior on how to improve intergovernmental coordination, as well as how to identify best practices for federal, state, local, and tribal law enforcement when responding to the violence directed at American Indians and Alaska Natives. I know that Native voices haven't always been heard on these issues, but this administration is committed to doing better, and today's announcement reflects that commitment. More broadly, the Commission also demonstrates the emphasis that the Biden-Harris administration has placed on addressing the crisis of missing or murdered Indigenous people. Last November, the President issued a new executive order, which reflected our whole-of-government response to promoting public safety in Native communities. The same day, I launched a new steering committee, which is dedicated to marshaling the Justice Department's personnel and resources to the MMIP crisis. Since it launched, the steering committee has made tribal engagement the cornerstone of its work, including through consultations and engagement with stakeholders. While those conversations are ongoing, the department is already moving to address the concerns we've heard from you. First, we've heard a clear and consistent message that the department must do more to reach Native victims, survivors, and families. That's why I'm pleased to announce that today we're creating a new position to spearhead our efforts, a National Native American Outreach Services Liaison. The liaison will work in our Executive Office of U.S. Attorneys and help ensure that victims and their families have a voice within the department as they navigate all stages of the criminal justice system. This new position is part of a larger effort to raise awareness and increase outreach on the MMIP crisis. Last month, the department launched a new page on our Tribal Justice and Safety website dedicated to elevating the issue of MMIP. This new website serves as a central hub of resources for families and victims and also promotes transparency on the department's law enforcement efforts. Last week, I also had the opportunity, along with Secretary Holland, to celebrate the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act and its important provisions to promote safety in tribal communities. That includes expanded special tribal criminal jurisdiction, which recognizes the authority of tribal courts to exercise jurisdiction over crimes of family violence, including child abuse, that too often are precursors to missing or murdered person cases. Of course, we know that there is much more work to do, and this day is a reminder of just how critical those efforts are. Today and every day, the federal government must be committed to working with tribal nations to address the crisis of missing or murdered Indigenous people, and I expect the Commission to play a major role in doing so. The Department of Justice is eager to support and learn from the Commission's work. Thank you.
We are so grateful to Deputy Attorney General Monaco and the Department of Justice for their partnership as we move the Not Invisible Act Commission forward. Now we'll hear from Fawn Sharp, President of the National Congress for American Indians and fierce advocate for Indigenous communities. President Sharp, the floor is yours.
Thank you for inviting me to join this important event to highlight the national crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous peoples across our country. Problem that has been allowed to grow over the years, decades, and centuries due to the limitations that the federal government unjustly placed on tribal nations and our ability to hold non-Indians accountable in the tribal justice system. The violence grew because the federal government has chronically failed in its trust responsibility to properly fund tribal public safety and justice needs. Often, our relatives go missing and or murdered with little to no response from law enforcement. In the 2018 Broken Promises report, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights reported that although overall funding for public safety in Indian country has increased, it doesn't even come close to meeting the public safety needs in Indian country. In 2017, the BIA estimated it funded only 21% of law enforcement, 49% of detention centers, and 3% of tribal court needs. And the commission noted that the failure to provide sufficient federal funding undermines the ability of tribal governments to provide criminal justice and public safety for our citizens. Having the authority to hold perpetrators accountable is an important first step, but tribal nations cannot follow through to hold bad actors accountable without adequate and consistent funding for tribal justice systems to support our courts, judges, police, prosecutors, public defenders, victim advocates, and an array of victim services. Tribal leaders have continued to share that the lack of secure and sustainable funding has prevented us from holding perpetrators accountable, helping survivors, establishing preventative services in our communities, and instituting alternatives to incarceration. In addition to securing sustainable and mandatory public safety and justice funding, our federal government partners must effectively communicate and coordinate both in funding and in information sharing. We must take bold steps to fully restore tribal nations' inherent authority to prosecute bad actors and to ensure that the federal government provides steady equitable, and non-discretionary funding directly to tribal nations for their public safety needs. Our federal partners must effectively communicate and coordinate among themselves and with tribal nations to ensure that our people no longer fall through the cracks. Thank you so much, Secretary, for your fierce leadership in bringing us together to celebrate yet another historic and long overdue milestone of success during your tenure as Secretary. I look forward to the rest of our important discussion today. Siakwil, thank you.
Thank you so much, President Sharp. And you're absolutely right that resources to address this crisis have been chronically underfunded for too long. We'll be looking to the Not Invisible Act Commission to guide us on where our federal dollars can be aimed most effectively. President Sharp, this year we made monumental strides with the 2022 reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act. In your opinion, what steps should we be taking next to continue combating the MMIP crisis?
Thank you for that question, Secretary Holland. The importance and magnitude of the tribal provisions that were passed in VAWA 22 cannot be overstated. It is truly a significant accomplishment that we must celebrate, one that seeks to fully acknowledge our inherent tribal sovereignty and restore our tribal jurisdiction. We must also make sure that VAWA 22 is effectively implemented so that it can be successful all across the Indian country. The federal government
President Sharp, this is such an important message, and we'll give her a half a second to see if she is able to reconnect. President Sharp, your voice is incredibly important, and I'm so grateful for your leadership on MMIP because your leadership is invaluable. Now, I'd like to turn the floor to Lucy Rain Simpson, the Executive Director of National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. Lucy.
I'm needing my camera turned on. From the host, but I'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, Yate, Shalusi Simpson, Inishia. First of all, I'd like to thank Secretary Holland for the invitation to be a part of this esteemed panel and the long-awaited announcement of the Not Invisible Act Commission members. The promise that the Commission holds is such an important one, and we really look forward to the work that the Commission and its members will do to move us towards a more safe and just reality for our Native relatives. Although missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls is just recently getting national attention, the MMIW crisis is not new. It was born in colonization and is a continuation of the traumatic impact of past federal laws and policies that were intended to terminate Indian nations. One example that is similarly just now gaining national attention is the legacy of Indian boarding schools. As more and more horrifying findings are being made at Indian boarding schools across North America, we can clearly see the connection between these policies and the thousands of missing and murdered Indian children. It is important that as we move forward to address MMIW, that we include addressing the full spectrum of violence against Native women, including domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, and sex trafficking, because they are all connected and all born in colonization. Surely the federal government has an important role in improving the response to MMIW. For one, because the crisis of violence was born in historic federal laws and policies and their lasting impact today. But two, and more importantly, because the federal government has an ongoing trust responsibility to Indian tribes. To move forward, we must demand real and meaningful coordination from all federal agencies beyond the Department of Interior to also include the Department of Justice and the Department of Health and Human Services. But the federal government can't do it alone, nor should it. As the Not Invisible Act Commission membership shows, we need a broad coalition to create true social change. As we move forward with implementation of the Not Invisible Act, Savannah's Act, and VAWA reauthorization of 2018, we must demand coordination and real buy-in beyond the federal government to include states and local governments, with leadership coming from our tribal governments as sovereign nations, because our tribal governments are in the best position to ensure safety for their citizens. Most importantly, we must ensure families and survivors are centered at all times, as their experiences will be the guideposts for how to improve the response to MMIW. I look forward to the Not Invisible Act Commission's work and the recommendations that will come out of that work, but more importantly, I look forward to real, meaningful implementation of those recommendations. Thank you again, Secretary Holland, for your dedication and moving the commission and the work to end violence against Native women forward in your tenure so far. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Director Simpson. And you're absolutely right. Coordination with tribal communities and families is paramount to effectively addressing violence against Native people, and the MMIP crisis is an extension of that. In addition to improving the response to the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous peoples, what else can everyone do to help?
Well, we need to be looking at prevention. We need to move beyond just improving the response to missing and murdered relatives after they go missing, when we need to move towards prevention. Native communities have countless strengths that we can build upon to create a more holistic approach to safety. And so we need to really center our Indigenous protections that we have from our own communities. It will require leadership by our tribal governments and increased investment in our tribal infrastructures, which means more resources, because infrastructure is key to reducing crime and increasing safety generally. An important place to start would be ensuring safe housing. The ongoing and historical crisis of MMIW is reflective of the severe shortage of safe housing and the shelter disparity that is experienced by Native survivors of violence. Safe housing is a foundational aspect of prevention. That's why at NIWRC, we've launched a new resource center, the STARS Indigenous Safe Housing Center. The center staff has created a foundational platform of housing and shelter as a non-negotiable human right. And this new center is going to be a key part of our prevention focus in regards to MMIW and other forms of gender-based violence. And you can follow us on social media at Safe Housing for All and at NIWRC for updates.
Thank you so much, Director Simpson. I want to thank you and the entire National Indigenous Women's Resource Center for the work you do every day to support families and survivors. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you. Yeah.
I am now very proud to bring President of the Bay Mills Indian Community, Whitney Gravel, on the screen to share her experience with another facet of this crisis. President Gravel, you have the floor.
Ani Bojo, Giwedi Nagabo, Quain Dijnakas, Ganushnakani Ndonjaba. Chimigwich, thank you, Secretary Holland, for the honor to join today for the announcement of the Not Invisible Act Commission. Bay Mills Indian Community was one of the first tribal nations in the United States to complete a missing and murdered Indigenous people tribal community response plan. In preparation for the implementation of this plan, we learned firsthand that improving safety in the day-to-day lives of our tribal citizens in Indian country is the responsibility of a broad range of justice institutions, both within and outside of our reservation boundaries. It requires a strong element of cooperation, as improving safety necessitates the involvement of social services, public health providers, tribal and non-tribal policymakers, federal and state officials, and residents of tribal communities, among others. It also requires a broad range of education, as the current spectrum of violence against Indigenous women is intertwined with systematic barriers embedded within state and federal governments. Through the efforts of many women, including those here today, state and local law enforcement agencies are becoming more aware about the issues surrounding missing and murdered Indigenous women, but they do not yet understand the complex jurisdictional schemes that exist for tribes in the United States. They do not yet understand that tribal nations have been denied that ability to prosecute non-Indian perpetrators, and that a lack of resources impedes investigation and help from the federal government, which then prevents tribes and tribal nations from providing Native women, Indigenous women, the protection and the help that they deserve. Although we were able to create strategic partnerships within tribal and state law enforcement agencies in the development of our community response plan, the development of that plan did not come without many lessons regarding the gaping holes in information systems, data collection, and resources available to respond to any case of missing or murdered. Time is a critical element for effective response. It is not days or even hours, but rather only minutes that law enforcement has to save someone. Minutes to alert the appropriate agencies, minutes to investigate and detain or arrest, minutes to identify an individual as missing or as experiencing violence so that then they can be found before they are lost forever. One important tool that could be developed is the creation of a national notification system to close the gap in response to time for tribal law enforcement officials. Bay Mills Indian community in the development of our community response plan has created a partnership with the state of Michigan that would allow tribal nations access to the Amber Alert notification system. But that criteria needs to be modified to allow for more immediate use by tribal law enforcement rather than communication to state law enforcement. Furthermore, the Amber Alert notification system cannot be utilized for adults, which is a majority of missing and murdered cases. A national notification system would also be instrumental in helping tribal nations deal with commercial business operations, extraction industries, and large infrastructure projects where tribal nations are more vulnerable for targeted acts of violence. We must include implementation of that basic human right and elements of human security in all aspects of all industry that touches Indian country. A national notification, a tribal notification system should be part of the Not Invisible Act Commission's final recommendations. And I am so looking forward to the work that team, that commission will be completing. And I want to say miigwech again for being here. Thank you, Secretary Holland, as well, for your work towards protecting Indigenous women everywhere.
Thank you so much, President Gravel. The insights you have about the international pieces of this crisis highlight why the Not Invisible Act Commission is a multi-agency mission. I would love for you to describe some solutions that your community has identified for MMIP issues residing on an international border.
Yes, if we did not think that missing and murdered Indigenous people crisis was complicated enough, there is a fourth barrier that involves international borders that must be taken into consideration as well. Tribal homelands were artificially divided when the United States, Mexican and Canadian borders were formed, and it cut off Indigenous peoples from their traditional homelands, their relatives, and sacred sites. Currently, more than 24 tribal nations have land within approximately 200 miles of international borders, and 6 tribal nations actually have borders that straddle international border lines. However, we know that borders do not stop crimes and that barriers are invisible as we conduct ourselves. So when a crime occurs and that ends up traversing international boundaries directly adjacent or nearby tribal reservations, tribal law enforcement officers have no authority. State law enforcement officers have no authority. In instances like this, allowing deputation agreements or memorandums of understanding to encompass communication strategies and identify points of contact are essential in order to strengthen cooperation between all law enforcement agencies involved. Presently, this is done by Bay Mills Indian community on an informal basis through our traditional relationships with First Nations that reside across the border. However, the Not Invisible Act Commission stands in a unique position to form that partnership with the Government of Canada, with the Government of Mexico, to create international memorandums, international notification systems and commitments so that we all work together to resolve the crisis of missing and murdered persons across all of Turtle Island. And it is my hope as well that will be part of the committee's final recommendations.
Thank you, President Gravel. We appreciate so much your strong voice and everything you bring to this conversation. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. And I just want to take a moment, to recognize that we are embracing each other today in healing, and, recognize those grandmothers and mothers and daughters and sisters and aunties, so that the injustices they have suffered will not continue in the future. Miigwech.
Thank you very much. Very well said. I'm so grateful you were here. Thank you. I would like to go back to President Sharp. Thank you, President Sharp, for rejoining us. And we understand if you need to keep your camera off in real time, we recognize the infrastructure needs in Indian country. So, so thank you for getting back on with us, and please continue.
Yes, thank you. And that is a case in point on broadband and the importance of broadband connection. I'm here, the homelands of the Suquamish people, and even just a distance from a major city like Seattle, we have broadband challenges in Indian country. The last point I wanted to make was the Departments of Interior, Justice, Health and Human Services, and Homeland Security must coordinate, collaborate, and communicate among themselves and with tribal nations. Each of these four agencies must have a meaningful hand in the approach to address the MMIP crisis, or it will not be effective. We must pass key legislation such as the Family Violence and Prevention Services Act to fund tribal domestic violence shelters and preventative services, and pass a permanent 10% tribal nation set aside from the Crime Victims Fund. We must ensure that our federal partners fully fund tribal public safety and justice needs, and that this funding is transitioning away from competitive grants to being steady, equitable, and non-discretionary. This starts with the inclusion of these priorities in the president's budget and ends with Congress appropriating that funding. Finally, we must approach the MMIP crisis from a holistic perspective and listen to tribal leaders, survivors, and family members on what are the best ways to address this issue in our communities. We have lost way too many relatives over the years to this crisis. Today's proclamation and our VAWA 22 win are important moments to celebrate. This is also a time for us to continue forward on this positive and powerful momentum to finally draw a line in the sand to stop this crisis and stand together to say no more. This crisis will no doubt end with our generation. Siakwil, thank you.
Thank you so much, President Sharp. Very grateful to have you here today. And I want to thank all of our panelists today for joining us and for lending their important perspectives, experience, and expertise to today's discussion, and for the many years of dedicated advocacy all of you have given to the MMIP crisis. Thank you. As we continue our partnership with the Department of Justice and the newly announced members of the Not Invisible Act Commission, we will make strides in addressing violence against Indigenous people. We have a long road ahead, but it takes time to address the root causes of violence against Indigenous people, which are centuries in the making. It is not my goal to put a Band-Aid on this crisis, but rather address lingering impacts of colonialism, objectification, and marginalization that contribute to the missing and murdered Indigenous peoples crisis. That takes time, but I know that with everyone working together and the advisement of the Not Invisible Act Commission, we can do this. Thank you all so much for joining us, and stay safe.